Like I said, thanks a lot, Evan, for the opportunity to interview you. We're super excited here at Omegawave to hear more from you and your experiences as a coach, and especially in terms of using Omegawave. But before that, I know in Robbie's and the Muscle Mind Guys podcast, you did introduce yourself. I'm not looking to ask the full, full bio because the listeners can go and definitely should check those podcasts out. But could you just briefly introduce yourself and kind of your coaching career, and also talk about the company you work at, Training Think Tank? What do you guys do over there?
Right. So I've been working in this strength and conditioning industry in some form or another since I think 2012 or 2013. So definitely not as long of a background as a lot of people. But I think I've had some interesting experiences over that time. So I've worked for an organization called Training Think Tank for a little over 3 years now. And our primary demographic that we work with is elite CrossFit Games competitors. So we work with a lot of the top males, females, and teams in that sport. And we also work with a lot of regional level and mid-tier athletes as well. So that's probably the biggest demographic that I have my hands in and that we get to do our research on. And we also do work with athletes in other sports, weightlifters, bodybuilders, special forces type people as well. But that's my primary demographic and primary interest in working with athletes.
Is TTT an official affiliate?
No, Training Think Tank is not actually affiliated with CrossFit HQ, so it's a private company. So we don't have to go through like any of the rigmarole that a CrossFit affiliate would.
Okay. Now, how did you guys end up then working or getting such a following and such a clientele that is based on the CrossFit world?
So I think a lot of it, when I started working for the company about 3.5 years ago, it was actually a lot smaller of a company. I think our staff has like quadrupled in size since then.
Wow.
So my boss, Max Elhag, he had experience working with a lot of top CrossFit Games athletes. He was formerly an employee at OPT.
Okay, I see.
Yeah. So he had experience when he branched out and started his own company. He had a big reputation in that industry. And with our coaches on staff over the past few years, we've built a lot of proof of concept and built a good reputation for the company. So now we have the ability to attract like higher level clientele with that.
I can imagine. So one of the famous formula that people throw around in the coaching world is that coaching is partly art and partly science. And then that whole claim then generates very diverse discussion among people who believe in it or are heavily influenced by only one side of it. What's your take as a coach? What's your take on this equation?
Yeah, I think I've swung to different extremes in the past, and I think I've finally settled somewhere in the middle. I know when I had first started getting into coaching, I came from an academic background. I had like a biochemistry degree, was doing microbiome research. I was coming at it from a very hard scientific angle. And over the years of actually working with athletes, you generally get humbled by seeing that what you understand in textbooks doesn't match reality. And it goes in a lot of different ways. That goes both with using technologies like Omegawave and MOPSI monitor and seeing that biology doesn't match what you see in a textbook, and also getting to work with athletes and understand that whole like biopsychosocial lens. You realize that everything is so much more fluid. And if you're solely relying on academic data and these kind of cookbook formulas, you're never going to get past an intermediate stage of coaching. So there has to be some form of like art and intuition and just like almost a gut feeling that you refine over time, where some of the decisions you make, you don't necessarily know why you're making them or have a strict, like, I can't back up some of these things that I'm doing with the study, but feeling, and oftentimes when you follow those feelings, you see that they lead to more success than when you're following these rigid plans.
Do you find that the weight on these two parts of the equation, art and science, differs depending on the level of the athlete? So if we're talking about an elite level CrossFitter, you have to put more weight on this or that compared to, your average CrossFitter, your average gym goer?
To an extent, yes. I think in different ways than you might expect, though. I found that the higher level the CrossFit athlete, the less abiding by like the pure science actually ends up working with them, because they're a little bit more dynamic than a beginner intermediate athlete who tend to be fairly predictable.
Mm.
I also think the distinction of art and science, they almost start to collapse in on each other at some point. Because when you're using that art and intuition, it's actually informed by things that you know with science. You're not necessarily referring to academic data, but everything that you've learned in the past decade is informing your intuitive decisions. And then in return, those intuitive decisions do fall in line with some basic biological principles. Otherwise, they wouldn't work. So they're almost like a weird intermixing of the two.
Yeah. Now, still discussing, and if I look at more the art part, I put based on what I see in professional sports as to what is considered science and scientific approach and scientific technologies even, I put psychology more on the art side, even though it's a science in its own right? But given how I feel, at least, sports psychology is sometimes even underestimated, undervalued, but definitely oftentimes underutilized. Um, what's your experience in terms of looking at the athlete as a psychophysiological entity? How much psychology plays part of your daily interaction with the athlete, and your thought process as to, okay, this is the way I'm going to approach this microcycle, or even today, given what I just discussed with the athlete or what I observe from the athlete?
Yes, I think that definitely factors in heavily. When I'm writing training, I don't just, it is like you're writing, you're just this like robot that you're programming for, and you put training in and you get results out. It's that idea that if you have X training session and you give it to an athlete today or you give it to them tomorrow, it's going to end up with a different result. So whatever is happening in that athlete's life, if they're having a great day, they're in a great psychological place, or maybe they're stressed out, they just went through a bad breakup, it's going to be part of their adaptive process. So whether or not I'm thinking about it in strict terms of psychology and trying to analyze them, oftentimes simple as just having a face-to-face conversation with the athlete, like, oh, what's going on, man? Like, how are you doing? I could tell that you seem upset. Oh, you're not feeling that good mentally. Maybe let's not push your training too hard. So it's almost that dynamic nature of, if I were programming for myself, if I knew all these things that were going on in my life and stressing me out, I wouldn't go and thrash myself in the gym, because it's not going to be productive. I think it's almost just taking that step in doing that with the athlete, and even going beyond traditional sports psychology, which is often focused on pure performance outcomes and mental toughness and competing, starting to get into some of the deeper concepts. Particularly, I work with predominantly male athletes. That's just my coaching demographic has ended up over time for no specific reason. But getting into concepts with a lot of them, of like finding what makes them tick and why they're competing in the first place. Is it that like band of like false masculinity, that need to like dominate, that ego? And do they have any true like meaning and fulfillment behind their training? And if they don't, I find at one point or another that ends up significantly impacting their training in a negative way.
Now, that's a very interesting thing. So when you do these profilings, do you ever think that maybe I should try and change the motivation, for example, towards becoming the best in CrossFit, or do you just take it as it is and then work with that profile?
So it depends on the athlete, and it's a little bit of both. What I've personally found is with the athletes who are very externally motivated with like ego and wanting to dominate other athletes, that works great for a period. You have these very like dopaminergic athletes that are very hard charging, but you inevitably find when they do hit some form of serious roadblock in their training career, which is going to happen to everyone, whether that's an injury and losing a big competition, those athletes tend to go from here and completely crumble. and they tend to have a really hard time rebounding because it's almost like their identity is destroyed and they lose a piece of themselves. Whereas those athletes that have some form of deeper meaning and fulfillment, they still want to win and they still want to dominate the competition, but there's a reason for that outside of those like artificial constructs. They tend to rebound really well after defeats and they tend to get better from it. So I don't necessarily try and like shove a motive down an athlete's throat, but I will present them with these ideas and I will kind of play devil's advocate and just question them and be like, oh, why are you upset about this training outcome? And then offer a different perspective and ask, have you ever thought about it this way? And it's an evolving dialogue over time. If I just take on a 22-year-old male athlete, we're not going to talk about these things in the first month of coaching because they're probably going to look at me like, dude, I just want to go crush Peikon. But over time, you kind of plant these seeds and you build some dialogue. And as you start to kind of build a coach-athlete relationship, these kinds of conversations end up coming out authentically.
Mm. Have you found any common patterns in the Omegawave parameters when it comes to psychological profiles?
Yeah, so one of the interesting things that I found is more so than large physical training stressors, it's these mental stressors that tend to have the hugest impact on athletes' readiness. You might expect, oh, their Wednesday training session wasn't that difficult, and then on Thursday or Friday, you'll see that they're completely tanked, and you're like, dude, what's going on? Yesterday's training were easy. And then you start to dig in. They're like, oh, I had a huge fight with my partner last night and I'm like so stressed out and like pissed off right now. And it's like, oh, well, that's actually showing up on this device. So whereas a lot of people think about HRV or DC potential as just these physical training measurements, like, oh, you did a hard workout. The reality is that mental component is one of the bigger stressors for athletes in Western countries.
Totally. Mm-hmm. Oh, interesting. Yeah. So basically, you see other sources of stress highlighted in their readiness figures than just the one you would infer from your training load logs, basically. Yeah. Yeah. Good. Going into the Omegawave use in terms of the actual process, can you elaborate on that? So how many times per week, let's say, per athlete do you collect? How do you collect? Is it the athlete measuring at home or at the training think tank? How does that work?
So the athletes, not all of my athletes train on site because we are an international company. So for an athlete that would train on site, I would have them measure it at home. When you get to training think tank, the energy is pretty ramped up there. So you walk in the door and you're already like pushing 10 out of 10. Mm-hmm. So I think it would be hard to take a valid measurement there. So I would have an athlete take it at home, wake up, brush your teeth, do your thing, go lay down in bed and take your measurement. Don't have your caffeine or breakfast yet. And that's the same thing that I would do for my remote athletes, just because I find that whether or not that's the perfect time to measure, we do want it to be consistent and repeatable. And most athletes train in CrossFit gyms, which are crazy places, and there's no way to control that environment.
Yeah.
So for the athletes that are measuring, I have them measure every day. Generally, athletes might miss a day or two per week just because they're human, and we try and not get too hung up over that. And I also have athletes that I want to do physiological testing on. I will have them do measurements prior to the test. Mm-hmm. Obviously, we can't unless they have a device prior, which in that case, that is very helpful. I will just look at some basic measurements leading into a physiological test, like the stress, adaptation reserve, aerobic index, metabolic index grade, and just use those to gain some initial data points before I put them through an hour plus of testing. Mm. And I won't necessarily put too much thought into those before we do the test. I'll have them run the test and then I'll get that measurement. And then if needed, I'll have them collect additional Omegawave readings. After that, oftentimes I'll have athletes, okay, now go get a device. Let's measure it for the next few weeks and shed some light on what we're seeing in physiological tests, because it is just an acute intervention.
How do you achieve this data collection, consistency, and general buy-in from the athletes?
Do you mean how do I get them to like continually measure?
Exactly.
So I think one of the things that I tell athletes, whether it's using Omegawave or coming on site and do physiological testing, if I'm just starting to work with an athlete, I don't know anything about them. I could put them through proxy testing, but the reality is everything that I do with them is going to be a complete shot in the dark until I see how they adapt to protocols and how we go from there. So what I tell athletes is the more data that we could collect of this nature, the less of a guessing process that it's going to be for me on the front end, and the shorter that adjustment period is going to be. So if they use the Omegawave, if they get physiological testing, maybe we take that 2 to 3 month window of me kind of trying to figure out who they are, and we cut that down to a month. That saves us 2 months of the initial training year to figure things out. So I think athletes don't want to waste their time, and that's helping them not do that.
Sure. What's your view in terms of at least what works for your athlete? Is it more the rational way that you would approach it? Hey, well, let's talk about physiology. Let's talk about what Omegawave actually measures and how it relates to your performance. Or do you think that just mutual trust, sort of psychology, human behavior, is the key in getting the buy-in? What's your view here?
So I used to try and stick to more of that like analytical facts and figures type approach, because that's always what resonated with me as an athlete. I actually remember, I think it might have been like 2014 or 2015. I'd been using the Omegawave prior to that, but at that year I saw Val Nazedkin and Roman Foman talk at RTS.
The Ranfone thing. Okay.
Yeah, that was at Mike Ranfone's facility. I think it was 4 or 5 years ago. And after listening to them talk, hearing their facts and figures, I'm like, I'm sold. My assumption is that if I presented those facts and figures to an athlete, they would be equally as sold. And
yes, I thought that way as well.
Some athletes are really analytical, and a lot of my athletes are like engineers, and that's all they need. And 90% of them would stare at me like I had 8 heads and have no idea what I'm talking about. So for those athletes, the thing that's been most effective is a mixture of social proof. So we work with some of the highest level athletes in CrossFit, and most of them do have very high buy-in with the things that we're doing. So I could tell an athlete that wants to get to that level, look, these 8 games competitors are all doing these things that you're hesitant to do, and they've all had good success doing these things. That tends to help out. And another thing that I tell athletes is, whether it's using Omegawave, Moxie, or even doing basic body maintenance and movement work, which is not fun. No one wants to do that. But what I tell athletes is, like, you don't have to enjoy this thing, and you don't have to agree with this thing, but it's going to help you do your sport. I know you just want to go throw down, and that's great, and that's all you care about, but I'm helping you have the ability to do that. So everything that you're doing in training, just improving your potential so you could do more of what you want to do. Same with a general like 9 to 5 or weekend warrior. They probably don't want to do the body maintenance and all the things that they need to do so they could go have fun on the weekend. If they do those things, then they could have fun. So most athletes, they get to a point where they're either burnt out, injured, and then they wish that they did those things. If you could explain that to an athlete up front, it tends to work pretty well.
I'm sure by now you've already had days when objective data on the athlete didn't perfectly match how the athlete was feeling, or even what you were observing from posture, etc. How do you handle those situations? What's your thought process?
Sometimes what I'll explain to athletes is, you're looking at acute day-to-day measurements, but these day-to-day measurements are part of a larger biological rhythm. So perhaps regardless of what you did the day before, you would have been in this low period today anyway. So your thoughts and your feelings don't always line up with that, because you're looking at like a small acute wave that's overlapping with a larger chronic wave that is your entire being. So sometimes they match up perfectly, sometimes they don't. There are times that I'll either err on the side of the data, and times that I'll err on the side of what the athlete is feeling mentally or emotionally. And it really just depends on the time of the year, how close we are to the competition, and the general context surrounding the scenario.
Now, another big thing that I got from your podcast is obviously this limited bridge performance model that you talk about. I remember the quote. I don't know if I can't remember if it was you or Robbie who said, train 40 to 50 units as opposed to 100 units, right? And at the same time, you mentioned also that in CrossFit, at least in the high competitive levels, people are addicted to going hard. They are addicted to training hard every day. Now, given this, it immediately came to my mind is, whoa, that must be a big challenge to Evan to kind of calm the guys down and manage that high urge to go balls to the wall every day and tell somebody that, hey, a 10-minute AMRAP is enough as opposed to having to do a 30-minute one, etc., etc. So can I pick your brain a bit more on that side? How do you deal with that with these amped up CrossFitters?
Yeah, so that's been like one of the banes of my existence for the past few years. And when I first started working with high-level CrossFit athletes, that was the constant struggle that I had. And I've tried a handful of different approaches to get athletes to start to change their ways. One of the things that I've tried that has actually worked quite well is I'll tell an athlete, oftentimes a lot of people will come to Training Think Tank when they've already been kind of like burnt out for a while or they've been repeatedly injured, because we do have a reputation of taking athletes that are kind of past the peak of their career and then turning it back around and putting them back on an upswing. So it's not uncommon that I'll take like a regional level CrossFit athlete who was at their performance peak like a year and a half ago, and they've just been burnt out and injured, and they're still in that place. And what I'll often tell them is, whatever amount of volume, intensity, frequency that you're using, I'm going to adjust it in this way. I understand that you don't want to do that, but give me this amount of weeks. And if at the end of this period you don't feel better and you don't hit any PRs, then I'll program whatever you want. And they're like, okay. So I get them to mentally commit and buy in for a certain period of weeks, and inevitably they end up feeling better. And then that kind of takes care of the buy-in situation. But there are always the athletes that get the good results when they buy in and they still want to do more again. They've started to hit PRs, their joints don't hurt, their libidos come back, and they're like, right, it's time to hit doubles every day again, right? And what I'll often tell people is, in CrossFit particularly, this is an issue. When I used to be a track and field athlete, I was always an athlete that had to train with pretty high volume to get results. And it really sucked when I'd be running 70 miles a week to run a certain mile time, and my buddy would be running 30 miles a week and we'd have the same PRs. He never wished that he could double his training volume to get the same results. But for whatever reason, CrossFit athletes always want to train more, even if all data points show that they are not high volume athletes. So I'll oftentimes present data to people. I'll be like, right, when we train this low volume, these are what your training progressions look like. This is the percent increases on your lifts, your improvements on Metcons. Every single time we've increased your volume by over this percentage, this has been your rate of progress and this has been your injury reports. 6 times, I have the data from all 6 times, and it shows that you are not a high volume athlete. So you have 2 choices. If you want to be the best competitor you can, you will do whatever you have to do to get to that level. And that means not training when you want to train. If you just want to work out all the time, that's okay, but accept the fact that you're not pushing to your competitive edge. There's a quote by Stephen King where he talks about, it's in his book On Writing, where it says for type A people, the hardest part of the work is not doing the work. And I think that applies to CrossFit athletes or athletes in general that are very hard charging. Going to the gym for 6 hours a day, it's not that hard when you love training. The really hard part is sitting on your couch and watching Netflix for 3 hours. So I think it's just some of that cognitive reframing for athletes.
Yeah. Now, one of the common themes in both the Mind Muscle and the Robbie Bork's podcast was obviously your discussion around work capacity training or endurance training, whatever, energy systems training, whatever term you want to use for this. And you've said that the traditional models from track and field, for example, don't really work that well in CrossFit. Now, you've talked extensively how Moxie helps you understand and program better. Now, when it comes to Omegawave, have you seen any patterns that help you understand the limiting factor of an athlete in your population?
So the interesting thing is I've been using Omegawave a lot longer than I've been using Moxie. So initially, when I started using Omegawave, I would find that there's always been this discussion. There's kind of like outside of Training Think Tank, a general group of coaching organizations that do some similar stuff to us. And there's always been these discussions of you're training this very powerful athlete and they're only doing easy aerobic work and they're just getting stronger and putting on muscle and they're not doing strength work. And that was always used as kind of like a boasting point by these coaching organizations. Like we could have the guy only low year zone one work and he's getting jacked and put 30 pounds on his clean and jerk. And everyone would be like, oh my God, they have the best protocols. And for a while, I was always like, man, that's awesome. But then when I started digging deeper into that and understanding it, I'm like, oh, that's actually just subpar adaptation to aerobic work. So what I was finding is with these more powerful, heavily muscled athletes, or we would call delivery limited athletes, maybe that Kalipa type, they could do like 30 minutes of easy aerobic work at like 130 beats per minute, which you would think is pretty easy. And after you would do their Omegawave readings, you'd see their anaerobic scores would shoot through the roof. And you're like, what is going on? There's no reason that should be.
And when you say anaerobic, you're referring specifically to the anaerobic index on Omegawave, right?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
And oftentimes you'd also see their metabolic index grade would go down when they were doing that work as well. And for the life of me, I couldn't figure out why. And I know I had conversations. I know you're familiar with Aaron Davis. Yeah. I talked about this maybe like 5-6 years ago. And he had told me, he's like, yeah, I see the same thing. Every time I give a CrossFit athlete of a certain build, easy aerobic work or sport-specific work, I'm seeing that. Years later, after continually observing this trend, which did influence how I was programming and trying to find ways not to make that happen, once the Moxie came into it and I was seeing what was happening inside the muscle, it made perfect sense. You would see these athletes, oftentimes when they're doing very easy aerobic work, if there's any form of mixed component or any form of intra-abdominal pressure bracing, they would create massive venous and arterial occlusion. And when there's call it like a blockage, quote unquote, in the muscle, the heart's going to be driven to push through that. And when that occurs, there's going to need to be like an increase in stroke volume and using that like concentric portion of the heart. And I think what's happening is due to the connection between the heart, the brain, that's propping up those anaerobic scores. So those athletes, despite the fact that they're doing what appears to be easy aerobic work on paper, that's not the adaptive response that they're getting. It's that idea that like the demands of the session does not equal the adaptation or stimulus of the session. So for those athletes, their aerobic development looks very different from what you classically use with an endurance athlete, which has very different physiology, or even a respiratory limited CrossFit athlete, that was kind of the genesis of that entire limiter bridge performance model and training of delivery limited, respiratory limited, and utilization limited athletes in very different ways.
Mm-hmm. Now, my understanding of CrossFit, when I think about the training, is that they do tend to spend significant amount of time in states of acidosis and hypoxia in the sport-specific feats. Have you seen now, when you compare to the other population that you do have experience with, do you see more variation in a certain parameter in Omega? Or you already mentioned the energy supply indices, namely the metabolic grade and the anaerobic indices. But for example, these potential HRV markers, do you see more fluctuation compared to non-CrossFit people?
So I think for me, it's less of a differentiation between CrossFitters and non-CrossFitters as it is respiratory limited CrossFit athletes look very much like endurance athletes that you might see in like triathlon or cross-country skiing or mountain biking I work with.
Right.
And the delivery limited athletes look a lot like what you'd expect with like a high-level sprinter or a power lifter. So even though they are athletes in the same sport, it's similar to how with an 800 meter and track is kind of that event where you have athletes of two very different physiologies. You have the 800 meter runners that looked like me, kind of taller, skinnier, lankier guys. And then you have the 800 meter runners that are really jacked and like thick and look like sprinters. And they have to train in completely different ways and they have very different physiologies. And CrossFit, it's similar. You have these two distinct body types. So you'll see very different measures, something like the aerobic indexes. You'll see when those delivery limited athletes are in sport specific phases, they quickly could get adaptation reserves that are under like a 3, which to me would mean like they're pretty much like have an exhausted adaptation response. Where a respiratory limited athlete, you might see them as like a 5, 6, or 7, and they'll be able to maintain that through an entire season, which to me would mean that they have pretty good adaptive response and they kind of have enough of that currency to keep adapting positively to work.
Now, you've talked about how you use the data, Moxie data, Omegawave data in terms of programming. How much do you actually try to influence what the athlete does at home in terms of recovery protocols and nutritional choices, etc.?
Yes, that's a decently big part of it for me. So obviously, I don't have very rigid or strict thoughts on like type of diet is the best. I think there's a lot of individual variation there, and I do have a handful of people that I really trust and respect that I'll refer athletes out to. But there's a lot of work into controlling their food quality and quantity, and that doesn't mean always weighing and measuring. It can mean still having like a healthy relationship with food, their sleep, their stress, their emotions, getting contact with sunlight, spending time in nature, having positive social interactions. A lot of these things aren't typically people might think of as recovery protocols. I feel like athletes always want me to tell them that you need to be doing like cryotherapy and Normatec and photobiomodulation, and they want me to tell them these like crazy high-level tweaks to their recovery. But the reality is most of that I've seen being effective based on subjective and objective feedback is kind of the simple things that everyone knows they should be doing, but no one actually does, because it's hard to believe that like, oh, if you go home and you spend some quality time with your partner and you have a nice meal and you go to sleep on time, that's going to have more of a positive impact on your recovery than if you go do a 2-hour cryo session and massage. It doesn't seem like that should be the case because one of them costs nothing and one of them is very fancy. So those are more of the things that we try and control versus other recovery interventions.
Right. Keep it simple.
Yep.
One of the things that you also told is how you use Moxie to identify, for example, interval volume. Looking at the oxygen saturation and to see when is the optimal time for each specific protocol. Now, one of the key questions we always get is, well, hey, what's the difference in terms of volume between green strength window and yellow strength window, or the two yellow, the upper yellow and the lower yellow strength window? How much should I take out from my 5x5 back squat set? Have you done any experimentation, or do you have any insights into how do you look at this kind of data when it comes to volume and intensity?
Yeah, so the combination of using Omegawave and Moxie has led to us creating a lot of auto-regulated training protocols to try and navigate the situation, because that's kind of a philosophical issue that I used to struggle with in the past. I would see maybe I had this workout written on paper. For a simple example, let's say it was that 5x5 back squat, and I'm expecting the athlete to be like in the green, and maybe they're not looking so hot that day. So I'm like, oh, I need to cut down their training volume, but how much? Maybe that 5x5 isn't actually that hard for them, or maybe that's too much. At the end of the day, anything we write on paper is actually pretty arbitrary. So there was never a strict way for me to say like, well, what is too much and what is too little, and how do I make these changes? So I part has been kind of data for each athlete over time and starting to understand how a protocol will impact them, so you can make more informed decisions of how to kind of ramp it up or pull it back. But also using some of the auto-regulated protocols, you could see when an athlete's physiology will start to compensate in the workout. So if we were to use that strength example, I know with the Moxie and with auto-regulation, I think a little bit better known for using that with energy system training, but it has been a big thing for strength with me as well. So say that athlete was doing 5x5 back squat at 87% of their 1 rep max. I'm going to have them load up with 87%, do 5 reps, their fixed rest period, and I'm going to have them keep repeating that. At some point, I'm going to see changes in either their muscular compression, their ability to get blood into the muscle during the movement and subsequently after the movement, and they're going to start to have changes in how they desaturate the muscle while they're squatting. At some point, the muscle will not be receptive to taking an O2, or the O2 will not rebound between rest periods. All of that would indicate significant enough physiological compensation to me that we should stop at that point. What I've found is when athletes start to push past those limits is when they start to get a lot of the like suboptimal adaptations. People always talk about, oh, doing too much heavy strength training, it makes you too tense. What I found is that's not the case. It's pushing past that threshold is where you get those compensations and athletes start to get tense, or where they start to get those kind of joint injuries. And oftentimes those changes are very subtle. An athlete might feel exactly the same from set 6 to set 8, but I'll see something that indicates a very significant shift. And if I have them keep going, they might not recognize that until the wheels have already fallen off the wagon, so to speak. So I think there's a lot to that, and that's led to kind of like the genesis of different protocols to try and figure those things out.
The last one regarding Omegawave I wanted to ask you is, when it comes to the brain assessment, DC potential, have you seen any clear correlation with low DC potential and neuromuscular ability of the athlete?
Yeah, so I'll circle back around. One of the things I found is the athletes with the highest DC potential are often the ones that are best equipped to do that type of training, but have the worst ability to repeat those types of efforts in a fatigue setting, which is often what you would want in CrossFit. And the athletes that have the lower DC potential have poor adaptation to that type of training, but oftentimes very fantastic repeatability. But for CrossFit, I think you want it somewhere in the middle, where you don't want an athlete that's an extreme adapter to that type of work, but you want them to have a high enough DC potential to get that training stimulus, but also be able to repeat their efforts. So one of the highest DC potentials I've seen in a CrossFit athlete, and she had consistently high readings. I would need to pull it up somewhere. She was also like a previously like world-class power lifter, but has very poor barbell repeatability. And one of the athletes that I've seen, she was a high-level marathoner, came in CrossFit, had very poor ability to put on strength, but if you were to give her 90% of her power clean and go 8 minutes max reps, she would get like 38 reps at 90%, which, I mean, if you would even just look at like a classic Priplin's table, you're like, that's a week's worth of volume in 8 minutes.
And were these athletes exhibiting this DC potential behavior you just mentioned?
Yes.
So the powerlifter guy, he had a high, generally speaking, high level of DC potential, whereas the marathoner had a, generally speaking, low level. Decent potential. All right. For anyone listening to this who would like to get in touch with you or learn from you, from online resources, for example, how can they get in touch?
So number one would be Training Think Tank is where I do all of my educational content, and that's where I do all my coaching and consulting. So if they're interested in that, you can just Google Training Think Tank or look up Training Think Tank on Instagram, Facebook. They're on every social media platform. And for my personal content, I write a decent amount of free content, and I do that through my Instagram handle, which is my name, Evan, EVAN _Peikon, PEIKON.